Hello and welcome to Talk Gnosis. Often we are interviewing all kinds of interesting academics and philosophers who have something new or interesting to say about Gnosticism. And in this case, we're adding our own host, Jon, to that list. Jon has worked on a paper for a program that he's been involved with for a while. Nic Laccetti and I are both here to grill him a little bit about it, the various integrations of elements in it. Jon, you wrote a paper. What did you write a paper on? What's the title?
I'd say it's my favorite esoteric podcast, besides Schwepp or Justin Sledge's Esoterica. And if you're going to talk about religion in general, then, there's Religion for Breakfast, Apocrypha House. So in my fifth favorite podcast, it's a real honor to come on here and to talk about my work. So, Jason, the name of the paper is Towards a Psychoanalytically Informed Gnostic Theology at the Market, the intersection of ancient Gnostic theology and psychoanalysis and critical theory. I did do my best to make it long. I'm trying to make it longer. But so I actually graduated from university a long time ago. We won't talk about when. I should put graduation in quotation quotes there because I left school with a DRM, degree requirements met. I didn't do an honors. I technically left the degree open, but as you can guess by what degree requirements met or DRM means, met all the requirements for the degree. So I put that on my resume. I did sort of leave it open deliberately because I thought maybe someday I'll go back to school and to get my aperture up, do an honors, then do a master's. But that didn't happen. During lockdown, I started getting interested in the continental philosophy, its connections to Gnosticism. I've always been a fan of Freud. It's something Jason and I have talked about in G-chats before. I'm reading Freud again. And actually through esotericism, through Martianism, Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, the great mystic, he talks a lot about desire. And that just got me on a tangent where I'm like, desire. It's just something that's very French, kind of a cliche. French thinkers are always talking about desire. And I'm sort of thinking about the interesting ways that Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin invokes it. And I was thinking, who I haven't read in a long, long time? I'm reading a lot of Freud, and who says a lot about desire is Lacan. Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst who considered his work a return to Freud, even though that's controversial. So I started getting more into Lacan, back into Lacan, and I realized that I did want to do some more formal schooling. I found the Global Center for Advanced Studies, and I was accepted into their BA/MA program. This paper is to complete the BA section, since I just had that DRM. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this interview is that this is a very basic paper. There's a lot that I don't necessarily have to prove in it because it's very surface level. I'm pointing a lot to other people's work. You can say, hey, Jon, I don't believe this, or I don't think that this particular point is true. And, I can retort with, well, somebody else is saying it, right? I'm just integrating that, as opposed to what I want to do for the next step, which is the master's level, where this is basically the intro. It's almost the intro chapter to what's going to be the master's thesis. And in that master's thesis, I want to actually do theology, do something new and original by using these tools, by interlocking ancient Gnostic theology, as well as modern Gnostic theology, as well as the last 2,000 years of Gnostic theology as I see it, Lacanian psychoanalysis and critical theory, right? So I want to birth something new into the world using these three lenses, these three methods of understanding the world and the universe and the human being. And one of the reasons I want to do this talk now is I did this paper about a year ago. The master who runs my life, she's almost 2 now. She's starting daycare. My schedule's starting to open up. Work's been a little less busy. And I started GCAS again last winter. Started the master's section formally, but I haven't really been able to dive in. I haven't really been able to do a lot of work or even start this master's thesis yet. So I wanted to do this interview around now because this paper has been in my bottom drawer, not literally because it's on a computer, and I haven't thought about it in a while. I haven't thought a lot about what's in it or the thinkers behind it. So I'm hoping this will kind of get my juices going and some ideas running in my head for that next step.
And the audience, you'd say, is for your advisors, that kind of thing. Is it something you'd want to be publicly available?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jason. it's really for both. When I do the next step, when I finish the master's thesis, I do want to rewrite into a public book of some kind, right? Will I just give it away for free? Will I sell it for 99 cents? Will I try to get it published? Who knows, right? And then GCAS also talk about setting up a publisher or doing something with a publisher. It's not uncommon for master's thesis and PhD dissertations to become books.
Now, there's a part of me that wants to just challenge you to totally do it in 5 minutes, but if you can't, that's okay. But what would you say is the thread of your paper? Like, the title does kind of say it, so maybe say the title again very slowly so everybody can hear it. And then, yeah, like, assuming everybody knows, at least listening, what the general Gnostic myth is, maybe that we can intuit some details around some of the other more technical terms. What's the synopsis?
Yeah, so towards a psychoanalytically informed Gnostic theology of the market, the intersection of ancient Gnostic theology, psychoanalysis, and critical theory. So yeah, that does sort of sum it up, doesn't it? What I'm proposing is that these three things have never been combined as far as I know. The funny thing is that you can find sort of combinations of each two. So I actually, it's very rare. There's only a handful of thinkers doing it, two that I know of. But there are two excellent scholars out there looking at the intersection of Lacan and Gnosticism, right? There's quite a lot of people, too many to go into, who are looking at the intersections of critical theory and Lacan. There's lots of people looking at the intersections of death of God of theology and Lacan. There's lots of people looking at the intersections of death of God theology and how to understand the market and critical theory. But as of yet, there isn't too much using all three of these lenses. Now, I'm not just doing it for novelty. As you said earlier, Jason, there's interesting threads and connections and resonances between these three philosophies, these three bodies of thoughts, where I think they can go well together. Some of that are very powerful and perhaps have direct connections. So there might be some very subtle Gnostic influence on Lacan, for instance. If we follow one of the main sources for my thesis, which is Jonathan Kahana Bloom's work, he's a scholar that talks about Gnosticism as a form of ancient critical theory, right? Not that there's a continuity there, not that Gnosticism is responsible for modern critical theory, but the ancient peoples who created Gnosticism were doing something very similar in a very similar way, to the point where we can almost call it an ancient critical theory.
So there's Lacanian psychoanalysis, which really focuses a lot on the nature of desire. Critical theory being an approach of looking at the world as a series of choices that have been made by various people that you can then analyze those sources and try to examine better ways or different ways of making choices for social good. Radical theology, trying to perhaps uncouple things from the more rigid theology or the more historically based theology around how one looks at the nature of divinity. Some of the market theory involved how, again, connecting to things like desire, like how people can be connected to things that maybe aren't necessarily the best for them, but they are conditioned to want. And then connecting all of this to Gnosticism through an examination of forces that are built around you, maybe not for your benefit, but that also have things that can be uncoupled and understood that you can then move past.
I think one of the is to go back to something John's saying about, combining three things. I feel like I always struggle with that too. And because you usually have this experience where you're writing something and people, understand two of them maybe. And then it's like, how much of this do I kind of summarize? But I think one of the things that's interesting about the paper that I see, and maybe this kind of connects these two things, is that you're talking about Gnostic theology as an actual theology, or Gnostic, the Gnostic tradition as actual critical theory. Not, it's sort of like it, but it is these things. And that always seems to be a thing that people don't like. The Gnosticism part is like, well, you can talk about historically, but it doesn't have anything to say as its own tradition, intellectual tradition. So I don't know if that was a challenge for you to bring it in. It's just, but Gnosticism usually it stays historical in some way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for sort of a central thrust of the thesis, of the development of the thesis of the next step, right? So my thesis statement is basically, and again, really standing on the surface, is that the intersection of these three there's enough resonances as well as actual influences between these three things that yes, they actually can be combined together in a fruitful way. Like you could mash anything together, right? But how much are you torturing it? But there's things that line up with these three things that in many ways make them belong together. And I guess part two of the thesis will be coming into the masters, but it is present here as well, is that we've had the intersection of as I was talking about before, with theology and psychoanalysis for a long, long time, and the intersection of theology and critical theory now for a while. So part two, the lingering part of my thesis, which isn't that clear in the thesis statement, but will be clarified, is that Gnosticism, because it is something that is mostly historical, that's mostly been forgotten about, that has a lot of cliches surrounding it, and something that has been rejected from the use of Christian theologians, it can be brought into the conversation and generate something new. Because Gnosticism has been left out of this discussion when it does have these clear resonances, I think it's an interesting theological avenue for exploration.
I really tried to quickly summarize Lacan, but it's both about this nature of desire, but also the lack, right? Like this thing that there is always a space between the wanting or desire of something and the ability to get it. And even often getting it does not lead to fulfillment. It just leads to more desire. And that also, to your point there, Nic, language itself is involved in that process, which means that we have a lack of ability to sort of fundamentally communicate. Everything's opaque. I might be fuzzing some of the details here, but I don't know if that seems kind of correct. So like I feel like I can see some parallels with Gnosticism here, a fundamental distance between the world we are experiencing and the sense of a deeper connection that we are either separated from or not connected to or have to work harder to get to, etc. But yeah, is this the kind of your feeling that Lacan gives you some more tools to talk about that kind of experience and process?
Yeah, absolutely. And the paper uses a lot from a paper by Dr. Agasha Bielik-Robson, who's been on the show, who's going to be on the show again. I'll link her in the show notes, where she's actually able to, she kind of breaks the Gnostic myth. She considers forms of Kabbalah to be deeply Gnostic. So she takes the Lurianic Kabbalistic myth and breaks it in, which has 4 named stages about creation. The last stage does talk about the end. And that fourfold structure could also be applied to other versions of the Gnostic myth. So including my favorite, the Secret Book of John, which is what I use in the paper as sort of what I'm calling Gnosticism to make it simple, and the Gnostic text that I refer to most often. With the talk about the lack is very important, and some of its resonances with Gnosticism. He has this idea that when we're born, before we become speaking beings, we don't have a concept of the self. And we are united with the mother. We're actually really don't have any barriers. We're sort of united with everything in a way, right? Because we haven't differentiated. Language hasn't come in to make a cut, to actually give us the ways to understand the world, to think, right? Because we think in words, to take on the identity that can be articulated. So when this process starts happening, human beings experience a lack. A lack is generated because we feel like we've lost this primal unity, right? This thing that we can not recover, this oneness with the mother, which is this oneness of everything, okay? And this is an ontological lack, right? That is created in every human being. And this lack gives way to desire. So we're always trying to fill that hole. But the thing is that it can't be filled because it's actually something that helps create our identity. It's the thing that helps motivate us because we're always trying to fill it. It's an inevitable side effect of becoming us and adopting language, right? It can't be avoided in any way. So looking at his understanding of the lack, the generation of the lack, as well as aspects of our desire and how we experience pleasure, are very traumatic, right? Being born into language is a traumatic experience. Experiencing this cut, this separation from everything, even though it's not even true, is because we weren't one with everything, right? We weren't one with the mother. Even if in the womb there's differentiation, right? It's traumatic. And looking at Gnosticism, the creation myth in Gnosticism, we have something similar there, where there's a primal unity that when we become differentiated, which starts with God's contraction in Kabbalah, or starts with actually something kind of the opposite, contraction, then expansion in Gnosticism, God becoming thinking and creating the aeons in this sort of ripple row of emanations. There's this creation process, but something goes wrong. If human beings are imprisoned into the world, I'll say the world instead of matter or the body, and this is the world of a capital T, a capital W. We're born with this sense of loss, the sense of lack, right? Because we're born out of this trauma, this cosmic trauma at the beginning of the universe. But I would argue a lot of times with Gnosticism, the idea is we come from this perfect unity and we'll return to this perfect unity. But when we look at the Gnostic myth, the differentiation has already started. They might be in a holy unity. They might be, to borrow sort of Tolkien's image, at the beginning of creation, all singing the beautiful harmony. But at the end of the day, the aeons are emanating. They do have some sort of separate purpose and personality. So by the time, using the Gnostic myth, that the dynamis is stolen from Sophia, there is already the dynamis that becomes us. There is already a differentiation, right? This process has already started. Talking about lack, interpretations of the Gnostic myth from an excellent scholar named Laccadio, who I use a lot in the paper. He, again, is using the Secret Book of John, and he talks about Sophia's fall, her creation of the demiurge. In the ancient world, birth was used a lot as a metaphor for thinking. So what's actually happening here is she is trying to know God because she has God's wisdom. God's wisdom, by its very definition, has no choice but to try to know God. And what Sophia discovers is lack, is a darkness. There's something not quite right even in the heart of God. This gives birth to the demiurge, because she can't deal with discovering that lack. She can't deal with not being able to completely know God, because God is unknowable. God can't even know itself. This is actually much more explicit in the Valentinian myth, where instead of the birth language, it just flat out says, Sophia tries to know the unknown father, is unable to, and suffers a traumatic rupture. And there it's very traumatic. She falls just due to her misery at not being able to know, or perhaps not being able to know and making this discovery of a divided God, of a God that has lack, of a God that has the potential perhaps for evil, or evil existing within it. It's actually her tears that generate lower demons and matter, which she becomes stuck in, right? So I think there's some very interesting comparisons there, that perhaps Lacan is getting sort of secondhand, thirdhand, unconsciously from his studies, because he was very interested in the Christian mystics. He was very interested in philosophy. He was interested in Kabbalah. So he is probably getting it, not from Nag Hammadi, which just would have been coming out shortly before he died, a couple of years. He's probably getting it through Kabbalah. But it probably, very well, if I'm going to follow Gata Bielek Robson, it is actually an influence. There is a continuity there between Gnostic thought and Lacan. It's not just people reaching similar conclusions.
I feel like that's a great way to not just, like, I made it broad strokes, but you kind of really focused on the specific connections that you think are interesting there. Nic, I feel like I've been drilling on John on a lot of questions here. Nic, is there anything you want to pin on?
So I'm going to take one of yours a little bit, but is the idea of lack universal, or is it had some relationship to Western philosophy and Western history? One of the things that was interesting in the summary of Dr. Robson's work is this idea, using Lacanian theory, that Gnosticism is a byproduct of monotheism. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that. The idea that Gnosticism actually isn't really a heresy, but is always kind of this shadow side that will appear if monotheism appears. Is that like a universal experience? Is that something that we have uniquely in the Western world, or is it something universal?
Either that they've solved the problem of lack, or they don't see it as a problem the same way. They're not using the same frame, would be another way to say it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anybody watching or listening who's not familiar with Lacan, but is interested in religion and esotericism, is right away thinking about Buddhism, which talks about emptiness, right? And that the core of the human being is, again, another influence on Lacan's ideas around lack is probably the study of Buddhism. And we do kind of find this dichotomy between East and West, which not to have too many cliches, too many stereotypes, too broad of strokes. But it does actually line up with your question quite well, where, yeah, kind of historically, Western theology has seen Lack as a problem. And there's lots of Eastern schools, Eastern bodies of philosophy that don't. So that is actually something that other people have noticed and done work on. And again, that's very broad strokes, but it's, I think, something that is definitely there.
Can I just a quick thing on there about the notion of that East and West thing is there's a talk out there, I think on YouTube, Houston Smith talking on Gnosticism. And I think his subtitle is A Western Path Towards Asia. And it's been a long time since I listened to it, but I do think that he focuses, I think, a little less on the appeal of the more dualistic interpretations of Gnosticism, and instead sees it as a sort of an opening of the philosophic eye towards wider perspectives of God and reality and all that kind of stuff.
I guess just kind of connecting with that would be, in some of the solutions to this problem of lack or something that we might say, one of them is this idea of a divine self. There's like a true self, there's a divine self. That's kind of like a popular interpretation of Gnosticism or esotericism or New Age kind of philosophy or something. But I think it was really interesting how clear you were in here that true self idea is maybe a misreading of Gnosticism. And so it becomes closer to Lacanian psychoanalysis when you understand that what people interpret as divine self is dynamis or potential. So I wonder if that can help bridge the gap between lack as a problem and understanding lack to be in more of an Eastern way that is kind of maybe you're not trying to solve lack, but embrace that fact. So I don't know, John, if you could talk about in terms of that kind of divine self problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of the issue is that we're driven to solve lack, but perhaps working with lack, being aware of it, understanding how our desire works, understanding our relationship to lack, and understanding that everybody is lacking and perhaps even God is lacking, right, is part of whatever this mission on Earth, and it's not even a mission, but you know what I mean. If we're looking towards solutions, we have had other systems for, one could argue even something like original sin, which is an idea that's done a lot of bad, is a form of saying everybody has lack. But one of the issues of original sin is that it blames it on humans, right? It is a sin, a mistake was made by humans in some way, instead of locating it in the very heart of the cosmos, in the very heart of creation, right? So I think making that shift is very important. The good thing about original sin is that it was a great leavening ground where you could understand that everybody is equal, right? Because everybody partakes of this lack. That's it. It has this great leveling. There's all these positives when we're talking about this big negative. Sorry, Nick, I went on a tangent from a phrase that you said, but what was the actual question again?
It was kind of just I guess I need to talk, but yeah, it was kind of the idea of divine self as like a solution in a lot of popular traditions to the problem of existence, kind of. But it's very clear in this paper that that's not necessarily what Gnosticism means by dynamis.
Well, and what I enjoyed about that point in your paper, John, was that rather than making yet another spiritual system look backwards to some primal better time, the dynamis idea seems like it's about a forward moving thing. We are moving through the world rather than trying to escape it. Yeah.
No, exactly. And I think that the Gnostics are very sophisticated about how the self is created, right? Which I think now there's a lot more understanding that the self is constructed by society, right? By the influence of others, by our education. I think in sort of pop politics, if I'm going to find any other way to do a pop critical theory, this idea has become very mainstream probably since 2019. But I do see the Gnostics, with the construction of the self, with the counterfeit spirit, with the body and the passions, with the archons setting up certain aspects of society, because Secret John says that they set up the market system, right? That the fact that all of these parts of the self are constructed, even if it's by entities, I think is very interesting. And if we're going to follow some of these thinkers like Karen King, like Hannah Bloom, this actually is talking about society, right? It's a criticism of society and how the society creates the self. It's very common both in religion and the outside of religion now, right? There's this sort of secular idea that's very powerful that kind of comes out of the 60s and the hippies, which is there's a true self that is being horribly oppressed by everything around us, right? And we just have to liberate that true self. That's an idea that we can find in 90% of pop culture movies, and particularly movies for children, but also your favorite superhero movie. It's become a very dominant idea, but it is also thought to be a cliche that this is really found in Gnosticism. But if we read Secret John carefully, it's not really there. So what is the point, right? What is the cell? What are we doing here? And I think that there is this idea of developing something, being part of this process of God knowing itself, of the universe trying to know itself, of the consciousness trying to reach an absolute knowing, even though it can't necessarily. And instead of uncovering the true self, we do want to understand how the self is constructed and how so much of what's outside of us, we're quite porous, is actually inside of us, right? What we think of as the very core of the self, how we think and what we think about, what we desire. A lot of this comes from outside of us, even though it feels it's us, right? I think that maybe the way forward, as you're saying, is the way forward. It's propulsion, it's exploration, it's discovery, construction. I believe it's going to be a bigger part of the next stage of the paper. But I do talk about the work of Amari Rudy, who has a book called The Singularity of Being, Lacan and the Immortal Within. It argues that the subject, the thinking person, comes into being as the result of language, of the other, in Lacanian terms, symbolic prohibition. She says that there can be this demand, this encounter with the real that opens up layers, components of human life that exceed the realm of normative sociality. Now I'm reading from here. The singularity articulates something about the undead pulse of jouissance. It connects the individual to a paradoxical kind of immortality. It does not mean that the individual will not die, but he or she is capable of transcendent experiences, such as heightened states of creativity that reach outside the parameters of mortal life. Such experiences allow the individual to feel real, quote unquote, in ways that fend off the symbolic abduction and psychic death. This symbolic abduction being this capture of whatever the self is by all these things that have come from the outside.
I think what's interesting about it is it's not a problem to understand that the self is constructed. It's just a problem for it to be constructed through this kind of counterfeit or through ignorance, and not to kind of take control over that construct. I mean, it's not about finding your true self underlying all those things. It's that once you know it's constructed, you can construct it through direct knowledge or through kind of truer experience, and not just allow it to be created for you through these entities that are kind of pushing and pulling you around. So it's like taking control. So that could still be like a 90s movie about taking control of your life, but it's not that your true self is somewhere out there and you're finding it.
This does make me think we should also post links to a few of the Pop Gnosis episodes we've done, like on the island, because it feels like there's some resonances there too. There's also something like, I think that this paper, and I think where you're going in general, John, are both acknowledging and responding to some of what I consider some dangers of Gnosticism and positing paths out of it. I've got a true self that's being held back by entities that are outside of me, and which can also kind of turn into a kind of ontological nihilism. Nothing here matters because it's all just a big prison in my way, you know? Whereas I think a lot of what you're bringing up is like, instead looking, like if you remove this idea of like a perfect you that is being held back, and instead there's a potential you that you can move towards, it reframes the whole thing in, I think, a much more useful way, while also acknowledging that there is stuff in the way, that there is stuff that sucks, you know, that there is a lack, you know. I found Lacan generally kind of really challenging to me, because on one hand there's a lot of what he's stating as this like sort of contained system that I'm like, oh, there's a whole bunch of things I think that don't apply, that is not acknowledging, you know, that don't seem to be acknowledged there. And now, I mean, I'm only going from the summaries that I've read and from your paper, so you might have explained this in ways that I haven't paid attention to, but it seems like such total focus on that lack and then the ways that lack presents itself, to me felt like it was not acknowledging other experiences, but it does acknowledge that the lack exists, if that makes sense. And that does need to be acknowledged. And this is often, I think, the reason I call it often the Gnostic trap is that the world can suck, and it is appealing to find a system that acknowledges that, that isn't saying everything's fine, it's just God's plan, everything's going to be okay. You're like, well, I don't know, things seem like they're not okay. I feel like you're gaslighting me if you tell me everything's going to be okay.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, and there's also something I didn't really talk about the paper, even though I see it in Secret John, but, I am particularly in part 2 as I kind of dig into the continuities between then and now, talking about esoteric movements, the Gnostic revival, and maybe when it comes time for my defense, I might get a slap on the hand, or my thesis advisor, before we can get to that point, might make me rewrite some stuff, because I am generally a bit imprecise about how I use the term Gnostic and Gnosticism, right? And I do honestly believe that a lot of different occult and mystic currents do have lineages that go back to the ancient Gnostics, that have resonances with ancient Gnostics, that are full of Gnostic ideas that they might have gotten second, third, or fourth hand, right? So in the esoteric currents, there are actually ideas that are different from this uncovering of the true self, right? And so the Gurdjieff work would be a great example, where in the Gurdjieff work, you don't have a soul, that are divided into 3, like classical Gnosticism, like a lot of the way that the world worked, right? And you want to get those into alignment. The best example people can understand is one of these 3 selves is sort of the body and the bodily needs and the animal instincts, right? So by becoming aware of the self and how the self is divided, you can get a unity going and sort of generate a soul, generate a self. We find ideas like this in masonry as well, where esoteric masonry, where you're rebuilding the temple, constructing the temple. You find ideas like this in certain forms of esoteric inner alchemy, the construction of which is a vehicle for ascension, because you don't have a soul strong enough to get past either angels or archons. So I think there are some interesting ideas there that do sort of connect and are different from these ideas of the self and this uncovering of the true self.
I've got kind of a big question here as we start to wrap up, but Nic, do you have anything else you want to ask before
I've got a big question too. Well, I was going to say, because we touched on kind of counterfeit selves or entities in society that help to prevent you from realizing the potential that you have to construct a self. I was wondering, because it's in the title, but it's not so much in this, maybe because this is more of an introductory piece, but you've alluded to the market a few times, and maybe the title Towards the Theology of the Market is, academics use the word toward to say, I'm going to do this later. So it's a preview, but what do you mean by the market, and how does that kind of relate to what some of we're talking about constructing a self?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nick. And I would say, actually, of the 3 things in the paper, the market stuff is the weakest and the least developed, right? What do I mean by the market? Is I am using it as a very flexible term, right? It's doing a lot of heavy lifting here. So I'm really actually talking about everything from the commodity form to capitalism to how people think about how they interact in the world with each other through commerce, right? Skipping a few steps, since we're getting into wrap up, I do draw on some work that talks about the market system that we presently have, and I'll do a little asterisk here that this is a straight theology and philosophy paper. It's the same with Jason's law philosophy paper, the drawing on continental philosophy, that is not necessarily lined up with any specific dominant political ideas that are on the left or the right. I am seeing a lot of people on the right who are very critical of some aspects of the capitalist system, for instance. So we're just looking at people like Mark as a philosopher. We're looking at this philosophically to understand what is going on. But there's my disclaimer. The work's already sort of been done for me, where the market system, capitalism, has a particularly strong hold on people because of the way that it deals with us unconsciously. Some of these dynamics about loss that we find in Lacan is human beings they get a certain pleasure out of loss, because loss is so primal to us. It generates an unconscious pleasure. It's always unconscious. The other thing as well, so we get pleasure from loss, and then the other thing as well is desire. Y- The whole the lack can never be filled, right? And on an unconscious level, we know this. So we actually go out into the world desiring, looking to fill the lack, looking for this object, looking for this primal unity, but we clothe it in other things, right? It's hidden. So it's, I don't actually want that new TV. I don't actually want that promotion. I don't actually want that car. There's an unconscious want that these things represent. And because we know that unconsciously, even with our desires and our goals, we'll often kind of deliberately miss the mark. We'll kind of mess them up so we can keep desiring. Because if we achieve that thing and we realize it can't fill the hole, so we got that working for us. We have this actual attachment to loss, where unconsciously we like loss. We want to generate more of it. And the market system actually plays with these unconscious dynamics in ways that create a very powerful hold on individuals and kind of locks us into behaviors and ways of thinking about the world that aren't necessarily healthy. And the next part of that as well is where God comes in, right? So Lacan has this saying that God is the unconscious. So in Lacanian thought, there's this idea of the big other. Because we get our desire from outside of ourselves, because we have this close relationship with the parental figures, there's a part of us that always thinks that somebody is watching. There's a part of us that always wants to please somebody else. There's a part of us that is a little child in the crib who doesn't realize yet that their parents can't read their thoughts, right? And this also interacts with the market. So to make a long story short, the market actually becomes a god, right? Because of the ways that we're interacting with it, the ways that we want to please it, and the ways that it does help create our personality. So you asked Nick how it helps create the self. Well, the market system is very good at creating desire, right? Which gets wormed into our head. That's definitely one powerful way. So unconsciously, the system becomes like a god for us, particularly for people, particularly for atheists, agnostics, the surface, is being very judgmental, but people who are deliberately non-religious or lightly religious, because you can't see that you have this religious relationship with these powerful forces. First year university, 18 years old, dorm room pot smoking talk to be like, who's the real god, man? The market. you know like I'm hoping to generate some more interesting thought than that, because I'm not the first person. Well, obviously I'm drawing on a lot of other people's work for this god is the market thing, but we can find this in the Bible, right, where Jesus says there's Mammon, who is a demon or a god associated with money, right? You can't serve both God and Mammon, right? You can't serve this false god of money. There's the idea of idolatry, which I do think that Gnosticism adapts from the monotheistic traditions and sort of kicks it up a notch, right? Where idols become the demiurge and the archons and our idolatry, right? So I wouldn't be the first person in the world to talk about how people make an idol out of money, how people make an idol out of the market system. But is there something interesting in the way that Gnosticism understands an idol, the way that Gnosticism understands a fake god, or a god pretending to be the real god, or a god that people think is the real god, right? So that can tell us, so can we apply this Gnostic thought to this religious relationship that we have with the market, this religious relationship that we have with a god who is a fake god pretending to be the real god?
Well, there's something interesting in thinking about how even the demiurge and the archons and stuff are themselves reflections or echoes of another thing, so that they are not of themselves these things that have eternally existed. They are part of a process. The market is a god. There is definitely a sense of worship there, but it is also a thing that is formed by people who have responded to, unethically perhaps, people's desires and lack and all of those things. And so there's a sense in which it is an accumulative process. There was no specific person at a certain point going, I will create the market and it will oppress people. I think it's always been heck, surveillance capitalism exists because social media happened and then people discovered that other people liked it. Do you know what I mean? But it wasn't like I don't think Zuckerberg, for all of his faults, specifically imagined the business model he's now in.
Yeah, I think I was thinking similarly, where I think the unique thing about this perspective on markets, which maybe beyond kind of more traditional, just left or right, like perspectives, and that takes it away from just being like, a counter, like an old hippie being like, yeah, the market is God, etc. That thing is that often then the reaction to that becomes you have beyond the market, you have a true self that if you just get back to, like buy a van and go drive in nature, you'll find your true self, which then becomes the market tends to take over and and sell it to you again. So, because you're still thinking that you're going to discover this solution ultimately, as opposed to being able to have like a playful relationship to these different things that you're offered in the market, maybe. So I would think that the unique thing is that through the way you've set up Lacanian psychoanalysis and Gnosticism in this paper, your solution to that problem can't really be like another pristine location that you can save yourself outside of the market. It can't really just condemn it in this, because like Jason's saying, the market kind of is created out of human desires. So there's always been markets even before capitalism. So maybe it's a different, that's my opinion. But I've been thinking about markets a little bit in the last few years as well in that way, because often it becomes shorthand to beat capitalism, but markets and capitalism aren't really the same thing, I think.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly. And that is one of the reasons why I used market. And I was thinking, again, at the very end of the Harfacon of John and Secret Book of John, one of the things it ends on is the archons creating, the capitalism didn't exist yet, right? But them creating the market. Yeah, so it's, I think, to have the flexibility of the term and knowing that markets existed before capitalism and are popping up in this very obvious way. And it's very helpful for my paper that this very blatant thing is in there. Although they're getting it from the Enochian tradition. So it was in Second Temple Judaism and other Judaisms before Gnosticism, actually, that the wicked angels, fallen angels, they come to earth and they teach human beings a lot of things that are helpful, but also teach them things that are unhelpful. So including the creation of coinage and what have you.
So, John, I know we're close on the end of the time here. So if this is a question we want to save for another episode, then we can do that. But the other thing here, too, is that there's often in a lot of inside Gnostic communities, there's often a debate of, is Gnosticism literal or a metaphor? Or is Gnosticism a ancient form of psychology kind of thing? Often this idea of saying it's just a metaphor or it's just a psychoanalytic process. And people back then used it as a myth, but it's actually just, quote unquote, like to reduce it down to something. You say in the paper that you're not trying to do that. You're not trying to just psychologize Gnosticism. However, most of the paper does still engage with that point. Where do you find room in this process that you're talking about for that still numinous, still mysterious or spiritual experience that does not conflict with the system that you're setting up here?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jason, because I feel like there's things that I'm self-critical about on the show all the time, always reaching for allegory and quote-unquote psychological explanations, right? There might be an unconscious reason where I don't want to come across as insane or impolite or a crazy person when I'm talking about fake gods and such, right? So that's something I just need to get over. But I also often default to that mode because I think it opens up Gnosticism for a wider range of people. It's a little bit easier in this day and age for people to engage with Gnosticism if they are not on these perhaps more supernatural, numinous explanations, understandings, what have you. So anyways, I recognize that is actually a weakness of mine that I'm trying to get better at trying to balance off. But that long ramble is to say, Jason, that you are spot on, and it will sort of stay at that level, right? I will discuss this in the next paper. There's room for other understandings of these ideas and their application. Gnosticism is being applied, where we don't have to worry or think about some of these other aspects of the tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
These things are fractal. The Gnostic texts are very clear about this, as above, so below. So these patterns, these entities, these relationships are reflected all throughout reality, including in ways we can understand as psychological or philosophical.
Thanks, John. Thanks for sharing.